right.
All right. Welcome everyone to SIG Auth bi-weekly for October 3rd, 2018. Let's jump right into the announcements. Pass it over to Jordan.
All right. So this is just a heads up that the steering committee kind of delegated to the product security team. This is the group that handles vulnerability reports, security issues with Cube, to figure out how to go about getting a third-party security audit. And so there was an announcement for people who are interested in participating, and a few people kind of jumped in. And so there's been a team of 3 people selected to kind of interact with a third-party vendor to do an audit. So this is going to be evaluating different vendors and then interacting with them as the one selected to perform an audit. So there's a link to the issue tracking this, and I think this will probably be structured as like a working group type of thing within SIG Auth. So if you're interested, follow that and keep an eye out for future developments. But I'm excited about that, getting another set of eyes on things, external evaluation, I think will be helpful. The next item, I sent an email out a couple hours ago. Some of you know this already, but I've actually joined the Kubernetes team at Google. And so that puts us in the undesirable position of all 3 chairs for this SIG being from the same company. So to fix that a little bit, I'm actually going to be stepping down from the chair role and proposed that Mo Khan be my replacement. So Mo is from Red Hat, has been working on Kubernetes and OpenShift for a couple of years, really familiar with the authorization stack. And anyway, so if you have feedback, I think there were some responses to the thread already, but if you have feedback about Mo or about anything else about the switch, reach out to that thread or to Tim and Mike. I don't know, Tim, anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to officially thank you for all of your great work in SIG Auth over the last, I don't know how many years it is since you took over. But I look forward to continued collaboration through the tech lead role.
And like I mentioned, a lot of what I'm do day to day will still be similar. So I see this more of an opportunity to kind of get more people involved in helping run the SIG, and more voices, kind of spread some of the work out and make sure we continue to have representatives from different areas of the project. So.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I also want to say thank you very much, Jordan.
And also I support your nomination of Mo as well.
Me too. I guess we'll probably just do lazy consensus on the mailing list like we have done in the past, and send out a PR and maybe get it merged by next SIG meeting.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, so next up on the agenda, we have a bunch of discussion topics today. Is Aish's on the call?
Yep, I am. Cool. I kind of moved this one up as an announcement, but looks like it's not yet refreshed. So yeah, I am Aish. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce myself. I will be the 113 release lead for Kubernetes. and which started on October 1st, which is this Monday, and the release itself goes until the first week of December. If in Kubernetes Dev, I sent out a kickoff email which outlines the schedule and a few process changes and the time constraint that this release is under. It's one of the shortest releases. It's about just 10 weeks, keeping in account the 2 KubeCons and Thanksgiving, and then the last 2 weeks of December. We are aiming to get the release out the first week of December before we go to KubeCon Seattle. So that said, I wanted to just meet with all the SIGs and highlight a little bit about the feature / the enhancement load that you guys will be taking up for this release. We are not formalizing it, but the release team is kind of looking at this release more like a stability release, in the sense we wanted to encourage SIGs and enhancement owners to work more on stability related bug fixes / features rather than taking on anything that's sizable and risky in this 113 timeframe. So the stability enhancements, we are looking at landing anything that got deferred from the last few milestones / any bug fixes that you might want to get out, or test coverage and more, or improving the test cases itself. So we'll start the formal collection of all the features starting next Monday, October 8th, and you'll hear more from our features lead around this. But I just wanted to meet with ahead of time to just drive home this fact. If you could all keep that in mind while planning your 113 feature load, that'll be awesome. And we also will be working closely with SIG Arc this time so that they can wet the feature list to make sure that we can kind of have an idea of the stability release going forward, maybe if it works, and for the future years as well. So yeah, that's a heads up. So if you have any questions, more than happy to answer. If not, I have listed 3 features that are currently in 113 from SIG Auth, and they are all ones that were deferred from 112. My ask is if the feature owners, if you could go into the issues and then indicate what is it that's pending for this to come into 113, that would be great. Is it pending code fixes or docs or tests? That will be really helpful for us to understand the level of confidence for each of these features.
Yeah, thank you for coming and talking to us. I will update the API audit logging issue. I think we should just close that out since it went to GA in 112.
Oh, we did?
Further enhancements we can file as separate features, like the dynamic audit configuration one is sort of an extension that we're building on that.
Okay, great. Yeah, any latest update would be super useful for us.
I am unclear on how these things get bumped and progress to different milestones.
I think that's a completely up to the SIG, and the SIG leads and owners to, identify when something is ready for beta to GA. From the release team point of view, we look for test coverage, consistently passing tests, to indicate the level of confidence in a feature going to beta and GA, especially where we expect the quality gains to be quite high, and also complete documentation.
I guess I was referring more to that these features often get bumped from milestone to milestone by people in the features repo that are not associated with the SIG. And it's difficult for me I don't actually understand the state machine because it changes so often.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, the third one went to beta in 112. It's beta, so there's obviously more work to do with it. Does that mean we should put it in the 113 milestone? What does it mean to be in the 113 milestone? Is that intent to make GA in 113? Is that intent to work on a little bit in 113?
So again, Jordan can correct me because in case I'm misquoting something, but in general, we track it. We track it for a milestone if it's graduating, if it's going to change from beta label to GA in this case. If not, if it's going to stay in beta and you're doing some own enhancements, I don't. I mean, we don't like we track the PRs as or the bug fixes as 113, but not the feature itself remains in the previous milestone.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
I can also double check this with the features lead to make sure this is the process they're following, and then I'll circle back if that's not the case.
So just to clarify, if it's not progressing, the milestone should stay the milestone of the last kind of alpha, beta, GA progress?
Yes.
I think it either stays there or it gets put into like a upcoming release, like future milestone.
Yeah.
The key is that we want to be able to look at features in the current milestone and understand like what's going to hit release notes, what needs docs, what needs to have something done to it by the end of the current milestone. So it's not a great state machine, Mike. It goes like in a milestone, then it might go to like future for a release, then it might come back in if another stage is being worked on. It's not great. But.
Right.
So there is a tracked label on these each of these feature issues. So that one would get removed if this is not being tracked actively like a feature graduating. But we also have a bug triage lead who will look into PRs and issues separately that are, so we kind of catch any work that goes in, but it's not like a perfect state machine at this point.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions on the milestone tracking or 113 release? All right, let's move on to our next topic. Patrick, are you on the call?
Yeah, I'm here. So obviously we've been going up the dynamic Audit API for a while now. The recent developments were obviously Daniel coming in as the API reviewer, wanting kind of a feature add change to things. I was having a meeting over that resulting in possibly skipping down the policy object. I've kind of done that work now, and now I'm wondering if we can maybe solve that with versioning as opposed to skipping down what we currently have. And I guess that's where the discussions are today. So just hoping to make progress.
Just to kind of provide a bit more context for folks who haven't been following this, so the dynamic audit CAP originally did not have policy in there. And the idea was to use just use the statically defined cluster audit policy for all dynamic backends. And then Patrick followed up with a update to the CAP, which involved incorporating in the basically doing a policy per backend that used the same API as the statically defined policy. Daniel Smith of API Machinery had some issues with the way that we did the policy API and concerns about that. And we had a discussion on that. And in order to unblock progress on the dynamic audit API, we decided to scope the dynamic audit API's policy down to just a single top level action that applies to every request. So instead of having all these complex rules to decide, this request is going to be at the request level or the response level or the metadata level, you just set one value for all requests. And then the idea is that any further filtering on that would be delegated to the backend itself. And the backend could be a proxy which does the filtering and then pushes off to the final destination. So that's kind of, that brings us up to where we are today. And then, and Patrick, if I'm understanding correctly, you are concerned about this direction and worried that it affects the usability too much. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a couple things as we started talking about it internally. One was kind of the usability, and I mean, maybe I'm bike shaming a bit on that issue, but the other one's definitely as we play out scenarios of, okay, so maybe we want to do a V2, the policy API, which is kind of what Daniel's asking for. Maybe that stalls, maybe that never happens. Now we've kind of limited our path to GA in regard. All to like potentially satiate a hypothetical. And it kind of seems like maybe those two things are independent. The policy API should be iterated on as its own thing. And what's in the dynamic API should match the runtime API. That just kind of seems like that would make sense that we'd have one mechanism for policy as opposed to having multiple mechanisms in different places. And then, you know, if we get a V2, the policy API, we can then just swap that out potentially.
Yeah, I kind of agree about like coherence between the file-based config and the dynamic config. The issue with versioning, when you're doing a file-based API, you don't have to worry about round tripping. So it's pure consumption, like it's read this file and then act on it. You don't ever have to worry about having to translate that V1 policy into a V2 policy for someone else to consume. And when you're doing REST APIs, you do have to worry about that. So if we commit to this being a REST API and we let people submit and persist these V1 or V1 beta or whatever level we start the REST API at, let them persist policy objects in that format, and then later want to kind of radically change it and transform it and like make it something that doesn't resemble the V1 at all. That's very difficult to do when it's a served API, because you have clients requesting the same objects at different versions. So that's why it's versioning isn't a magic bullet for the served persisted objects. It helps a lot for the file APIs. Like you could come up with something completely different for the file-based API for V2 and consume both of those. Anyway.
I guess I'm wondering, what if we then version the dynamic API as V2 along with the new V2 of the policy API? Would that solve that problem?
Versioning can let you make some types of changes. I don't think it can let you make ones as drastic as what Daniel was describing. Like you can't transform the current format that's used in the file config to something like what he was describing, where it's not a list of sort of progressive filtering rules.
Okay, it's just because I would have to be able to translate from V1 to V2.
Yeah, we can't remove V1 until V2 is out, because you can't deprecate just a V1 stable object API until the replacement is at least as stable as ready. And the V1 and V2 policy objects are in the same namespace. So if you create a V1 policy object, that has to be able to be translated into a V2 policy object.
So there's no concept of like a complete breaking change between major API versions?
It would be a different object.
Just a different object. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
you can remove things and you can remove things, but it takes a long time. So you have to go from like V1, deprecate in V1, round trip it to V2, and then once you go from V2 to V3, you can remove it because it was deprecated at the stable point. It's a long process. It's mostly hypothetical at this point.
Gotcha. Okay. With what Daniel's asking, is that potentially a superset of our current policy?
I'll be honest. The last few weeks I haven't been following that very closely.
It's all good.
It is. I think there's a way that we could implement it so that it's a superset. I think that just his basic proposal is not a strict superset.
So what would we be doing in that case if we were to implement that? Would that just become a totally separate policy object?
Well, there is no policy object in the API right now. So it would kind of, if we just went straight to that, then that would be the way that policy was done in the dynamic API. I think that approach doesn't really apply for the static API. And so either that API would end up looking different, or we would want to figure out a way to kind of make that, that approach work in both cases.
I guess I'm just wondering if that makes sense to have two different mechanisms. It seems like that's, from a UX perspective, that seems confusing. To have two ways to do things.
It'd probably be good to kind of gather the concrete objections or issues with what is currently in the file config. I think that it seems pretty reasonable, at least from the perspective of the audit sync wanting to describe what it wants. When you start talking about like multiple actors participating in kind of contributing or defining what goes to a sync, then I can see how that could not be great, but I'm not really sure about that use case.
I'm not sure about it either. I mean, we definitely haven't seen it out in the field, right? Whereas we have a concrete use case for what we have today. So it's kind of hypothetical versus what we're actually seeing in the world.
I mean, the usage patterns that I've usually seen is that there are some things that you specifically want to exclude or have at low verbosity. There are some things you specifically want to include or have at high verbosity. And then basically everything else is kind of a default level. And so if we think in those terms about like the way you describe that today lets you do that. And if you wanted to have specific ways for sort of other actors to describe or contribute things, we could define points at which you could let things inject, like priority inclusions, priority exclusions, similar to what RBAC did with rule selection, where one role can say, I want to include the rules from other roles with these labels. Like I could envision extending this list format to let you, the person defining a particular policy, say, I want to allow people to inject stuff here based on some criteria, while still kind of following this list format. So I think I can see how we could extend the current approach to allow for multi-actor definition. But like I said, I haven't seen that use case, so I'd be curious to maybe hear from, it's good to know that you guys haven't encountered it. If there are other people who have experience with the audit stuff, that might be something to kind of put out a call for and say, how are people using the current file-based thing? Like, would it be valuable to be able to define it this way?
I think that this is sort of a new use case because it's not something that's like at all feasible with a file-based approach. You can't have like dynamic plugins that register different audit rules.
That's true, but the idea where you define an audit policy and then as you install an operator, you install some add-on, or you install some CRD, like types that you didn't consider in your original policy show up in your cluster.
Right.
And like how people are reacting to that, or if that is even a problem, or if it's not really a problem, and if it becomes a problem, they just tune it. I don't know.
Yeah.
So for action items, I think it would probably be worthwhile to close the loop with Daniel, ask about like starting with what we have and considering whether like getting concrete descriptions of the use cases he's concerned about that this doesn't work well with, and if there's ways that the current approach could be extended to work with those use cases if they became important. That might be the best path forward.
Okay.
But I tend to agree about like wanting to keep the file format and the REST format coherent.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. We should follow up with Daniel, as he was the main objectioner, if that's a word, to to this.
I objection to that use.
In terms of just kind of making progress here,
Yeah.
I do think that the approach that we sort of ended up with at the end of the last meeting of just kind of having the top level API, I think that that is compatible with any of the directions forward that we go, including taking the whole static policy format. So my recommendation is to basically proceed with that in terms of implementation, and then in parallel, we'll kind of continue these conversations about what the right API is, and go from there. Does that make sense?
Cool. Yeah, I've got that work pretty much done. And yeah, if you want to give me feedback on the cap, just to make sure we're in line all there. And as long as we're, I guess, okay with, mutating that as we go to beta and GA and everybody's kind of comfortable with that concept. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, definitely. Like additional things going from alpha to beta are very easy. Changes require consideration. If you change it in incompatible ways, that can mean that people have to delete all their alpha data before they upgrade. Upgrading with alpha is like you do it at your own risk if you use an alpha feature. So requiring people to drop their alpha data is always on the table, but if we can avoid it, we'd like to.
Yeah, sure. I think it would just be one field that we maybe have to either change or just allow it to duplicate, which would be that high level field of metadata or request response. That would be different from what we see today, but that doesn't seem too crazy. So
I actually think we should keep it, and maybe even consider adding it to the static policy API just as like the default level. I think it's a little more intuitive, and you don't need to worry about having that catch-all rule at the end.
Okay. Yeah, that works for me then. And yeah, we'll sync it with Daniel and get more recs then. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, Mo, I think you have this last item.
Yeah, so in the recent last few months, a lot of people at Red Hat have started to build little per namespace controllers / operators, whatever we decide to call it today. And just one of the things that sort of came out from that was since a lot of these are meant to be just run by normal users, not administrators of the cluster, to work on their own flows, they can't make events by the default rollback policy. And that the lack of inclusion in the default policy for events, I think dates back to the original authorization policy before it was even RBAC in Kube. So I just wanted to kind of get people's feelings for like pros or cons of having that permission in like the editor and admin roles. I kind of laid out some of my thoughts related to like how you could use it and how it could possibly be abused. So.
It's interesting. So we let admins and editors create like all the workload APIs and all of the things that result in events. I've said it before many times in many issues, but events are not a reliable message bus for a lot of reasons. Like they don't always get recorded if the recorder is under rate limit, and they get dropped at arbitrary intervals, depending on how the cluster is configured.
The way we often use logs or the events are kind of like have an event stream for people to watch. And so that's more of a UI feature, but a useful one to kind of see what's going on. And we'd ideally
like an observability thing. They have just enough programmatically recognizable things in them to ensure that people abuse them for like sending messages from one component to another. I don't know. I think anyone who's using messages or events and like for highly privileged things is kind of crazy, especially considering like every component in the system is given event write permissions. Basically every controller, every component, just not like human users. So it's not like it's a tightly held privileged thing. It'd probably be worth like asking kind of the user base in some way. We're considering this for this reason. Here's a summary of all the reasons you wouldn't want to use events for this. I'm trying to think if there's a way that we could do it so that if someone was unhappy, they could exclude that permission or continue to exclude that permission. I don't know.
We have no negative RBAC.
Sure, but like if you did this as an aggregation, so if you said, I'm going to create like an event writer thing, and by default, I'm going to label it so it gets aggregated into the admin and edit roles. If someone was unhappy with that, they could remove those labels and say, don't reconcile this back. Like, I don't know. What do other people think?
It seems like the requirement to write an event with a specific involved object correlates with writing the status of that object. That would be my observation. It doesn't help generally. It doesn't help if the authorizer is RBAC, but there might be some finer grain permission scheme that we could apply.
If only they weren't enormously high traffic.
Right.
I would think a status is slightly elevated over events.
Yeah. A lot of things write events about things that don't necessarily have status access.
Okay.
Are event resources namespaced?
Yeah.
And if I remember correctly, though, we give controllers cluster-wide access to all events everywhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, the controllers that are cluster-wide controllers, yes.
Yeah.
That ambivalent enough of response for you?
I'm just trying to think through it. Is there an open issue for this?
No, I hadn't opened one yet. I figured I would just ask, and if I got a complete no, I would just be like, there's no point in making an issue.
It sounds like a sane requirement, and my only open question is whether there's a way outside of RBAC to do it. But RBAC, namespace RBAC sounds reasonable to me.
Does anyone know the reason that events were excluded originally? I'm a little surprised to hear that they weren't in there.
They probably were just overlooked. Users don't ever create them. And even in this case, it's not that a user would be creating it so much as a user would be wanting to set up a role for a controller, which would itself be like creating events. So
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I can't
think they might have been. I think they might have been created before the audit logs and other kind of fine-grained controls, and so there was some thought that they might need to be authoritative, but it's definitely not the case now.
Yeah, I think it's definitely with an issue, and maybe copy different groups on the issue and maybe advertise it. I'm trying to think of the best way to kind of ask the question. Would this be concerning to anybody? The best place to ask.
Is there like a mailing list or something I could send the issue to, or something?
There was. I'm thinking broader than SIG Auth. Like, it's more the user community. Like, we don't want to surprise people who are counting on this being super secure. Mostly, we want to let them know you shouldn't be using this way.
Yeah, it would definitely be an action required release note, and Kubernetes announce could be used to pre-announce it. Not so much for discussion, but if we wanted to give some heads up that the change was coming.
Yeah, that kind of question used to go to Kubernetes users. I would see questions about usage patterns every once in a while. I think that maybe moved to the discussion board. So I don't know. Maybe ask in a few places. Point them to the issue to unify the conversation. I'm not opposed to it.
You could also ping Paris Pittman and ask what the best way to collect feedback on that would be.
Yeah, I figured I could ask someone like that or someone on SIGARC. Please help me find the correct, appropriate venue for asking community questions. But yeah, I can take that as an action item to make the issue and reach out to appropriate folks.
All right, thanks. Those are all the topics we have on the agenda for today. Anyone have any ad hoc things, or should we call it?
So do we want to do any coordination as a SIG around features for 113? Maybe send out an email to have a central spot where everybody says any intent to implement a feature or work on a feature in 113.
Yeah, I think starting a thread would probably be good. And this would be like a, what are you planning to do in 113 type thing? Yeah.
I can send an email out to the list.
Okay.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks. This is more of a heads up for kind of coming up. I would like to reserve some time to discuss sort of 2019 broader directions and planning. And there's some kind of central themes of the project that I want to talk about a bit, how we can better support some things like sustainability and reliability. And so maybe just kind of start thinking about some of those things and what we can do as a SIG, and then we can sort of discuss that more in 2 to 4 weeks, maybe.
Do you want to put an agenda item and maybe, if there were specific topics, maybe seed a doc or a mailing list thread just to kind of pre-gather some?
Yeah, will do. All right, anything else? Going once? Going twice? All right, enjoy the rest of your week, everyone. Thank you.